When did you see someone fail as a parent? My ex-wife gets our daughter Haley every weekend, and every weekend Haley comes home with a brand new injury. Bruised lip, scraped knee, even a cracked rib once. But the court's only response has been, children need their mothers. Well, last week I was getting ready to go pick her up when I got the call. It was her friend's mom. Haley's at my house in Woodbridge for a sleepover and her insulin pump just failed. We don't know what to do. Her blood sugar is at 450 and climbing. I felt my stomach drop through the floor. That number should never be above 180. Where's her backup insulin? I asked, already grabbing my keys. She doesn't have any with her. Your wife dropped her off and said everything was in the pump. My hands were shaking as I started my car. My ex always carried the backup insulin in her purse. She made a huge show of it during custody hearings, proving what a prepared mother she was. I called her immediately. She answered with casino noise in the background. Haley's pump failed. She needs insulin now. You're only 15 minutes from the sleepover house. Yes, yes, yes! I just hit an all-time record, she responded. Our daughter is dying, I yelled. You need to leave now. There was a pause. I could hear dealer voices in the background. I'm at the high roller table. I don't care what table. I'm down $3,000. I need to win it back. I slammed my hand on the steering wheel, pushing 90 on the highway. Our daughter is going to die. I'm 45 minutes away. You're 15. Then call an ambulance. They don't carry insulin. You know this. Only her prescription pen works. It's in your purse. I'm in the middle of a hand. Give me 20 minutes. The sleepover mom texted me a photo at 12:15. Haley unconscious on their bathroom floor, her lips pale, vomit on her shirt. The text said, she's over 500 now. Barely responsive. I called my ex again, screaming now. She's dying! Dying! Get in your car! Stop being dramatic, and stop calling. You made me lose that hand. The dealer thought I was cheating with signals. That's another 500 gone because of you. I hung up and called 911, explaining everything through tears. They said they'd meet me there, but confirmed what I already knew. Paramedics can't administer insulin without the prescription pen. When I finally screeched into their driveway at 12:38 a.m., the ambulance was already there. Haley was on a stretcher, completely unconscious. The paramedic looked grim. Blood sugar's too high for our meter to read. We need insulin immediately. My ex has it. She's coming. But she wasn't. Not for another 42 minutes. I tried calling the casino directly. My daughter is dying. My ex-wife, Rachel Beckett, is at your high roller table. She has life-saving medication. Please make her leave. Sir, we can't force guests to leave for personal matters. It's not personal. A child is dying. I'm sorry, sir. The paramedics arrived. I begged them to call her, thinking medical professionals would get through. The lead paramedic tried. Ma'am, your daughter is in diabetic ketoacidosis. Her organs are shutting down. I heard her response through his phone. I'm her mother. I'll decide when it's serious enough to leave. When my ex finally strolled through the emergency room doors at 1:20 a.m., her designer purse was over her shoulder, reeking of cigarette smoke and wine. Haley was already in the pediatric ICU. She tossed the insulin pen at the nurse like it was nothing. Here. Though you should know, your constant calling made me lose $6,000 tonight. I couldn't speak. Our daughter was on dialysis. The doctor had just explained her kidneys were functioning at 40%. My ex turned to the doctor, not even looking at Haley behind the glass. This is because her pump was defective, right? Manufacturing error? Ma'am, this is because she didn't receive insulin for over 2 hours during a life-threatening situation. My ex's face went red. She spun toward me. You should have made sure the sleepover mom had backup supplies. What kind of father sends his diabetic child without backup? The backup was in your purse. At the casino. Don't you dare blame this on me. You're the one who lives 45 minutes away. You chose to move that far. If you lived closer, this wouldn't have happened. The doctor interrupted to explain Haley would need dialysis 3 times a week, possibly for months. Maybe permanently. We had no idea if she was ever going to be the same again. My ex pulled out her phone and started typing. I need to document this negligence. 2 days later, I was with Haley in the ICU, and my wife was in the casino when I got the news. Haley's organs failed. She didn't make it. I cried so hard I ran out of tears. And over the next 36 hours, I called Rachel over 50 times, but she didn't even visit once. I remember that's when I stopped crying. Not because I wasn't devastated. I was. And not because my life wasn't destroyed. It absolutely was. But because I knew I had to destroy Rachel, and I was about to show her exactly how far a grieving father is willing to go. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot for 3 hours after they wheeled Haley's body away. My phone was in my lap and I was making lists in the Notes app. Every person I needed to call. Every piece of evidence I needed to save. The crying had stopped completely, and my hands weren't shaking anymore. Something cold and focused had replaced all that pain. I wrote down the sleepover mom's number first, then the paramedics who responded, the casino's main number, the emergency room doctor's name from his badge. I took screenshots of every call log from that night. 52 calls to Rachel while our daughter was dying. Each one timestamped, each one ignored. The parking lot emptied and filled again with the morning shift, but I kept working, making folders in my phone for evidence, writing down everything I could remember about what Rachel said. The next morning, 2 cops showed up at my house. They'd gotten my address from the hospital. The older one had a notebook out and asked me to walk through everything that happened. I showed them my phone with all the call logs, gave them the sleepover mom's number, explained how Rachel stayed at the casino for over an hour after being told Haley was dying. They wrote everything down and said they'd need to talk to the other witnesses. After they left, I started calling family members. My sister answered on the 3rd ring and I told her Haley was gone. She cried for 10 minutes straight, but when I mentioned going after Rachel legally, she got quiet, said she didn't want to get involved in our problems. My brother was the same. So was my mom. Everyone said they were sorry, but nobody wanted to pick sides. Rachel's family wouldn't even answer my calls. I sat at my kitchen table realizing I was completely alone in this. The sleepover mom texted me that afternoon asking if we could meet. I drove to a coffee shop near her house and she was already there waiting. Her eyes were red and puffy. She pushed her phone across the table to me. Every photo from that night was there. Haley on the bathroom floor at different times. The timestamps showed exactly how fast she got worse. There were texts between her and her husband about whether to call 911. Screenshots of her trying to reach Rachel. She told me she'd already talked to the police that morning, said she'd testify to anything I needed. We both cried in that coffee shop and people stared, but I didn't care. I spent the next 2 days at my computer putting together a document. Every call log got its own page with the timestamp highlighted. I transcribed the voicemails I'd left Rachel begging her to leave the casino, found the texts from the sleepover mom with the photos attached, downloaded my location data showing my drive from home to the hospital, Rachel's location data from her social media showing her at the casino the whole time. 52 calls she ignored became 52 pages of evidence. I made 10 copies of everything. 1 for the police, 1 for CPS, 1 for a lawyer, 7 more just in case. On the 3rd day, I got in my car and drove to Rachel's apartment. I sat outside for 20 minutes with the engine running. Her car was in the driveway. The living room light was on. I could see her moving around inside. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. I wanted to go in there and make her hurt the way Haley hurt, but getting arrested wouldn't help anything. I drove home and went straight to my garage, put 3 holes in the drywall with my fist. My knuckles bled, but it felt better than doing nothing. Detective Cade Norris called me the next day. He'd been assigned to investigate whether criminal charges were possible. We met at the police station and I gave him my evidence binder. He flipped through it slowly and his face got more serious with each page. But then he leaned back and explained the problem. Rachel wasn't physically there when Haley got sick. She didn't actively hurt her. Proving criminal negligence when a parent was absent is really hard. He said they'd investigate but told me not to expect fast results or maybe any results at all. I filed a report with CPS that same week. The investigator who showed up was Regina Norris. Turns out she was Cade's sister. She took my evidence binder and said she'd evaluate Rachel's fitness as a parent. I explained that Haley was already gone, so there wasn't a child to protect anymore. Regina said it didn't matter. The report would create an official record that could support other legal actions. She seemed to actually care about what happened. Rachel and I had to meet at the funeral home to make arrangements. She showed up 45 minutes late. The funeral director was already showing me casket options when she walked in. She took one look at the prices and started yelling about wasting money. Said we should just do cremation with no service. I wanted a proper funeral for our daughter. The funeral director had to step between us when Rachel started screaming that I was trying to bankrupt her. She kept saying Haley wouldn't know the difference anyway. I paid for everything myself just to end the fighting. The funeral was 3 days later. Rachel showed up 20 minutes after it started. I could smell the alcohol from 10 feet away. She stumbled up to the podium and tried to give a speech about being a devoted mother. Her words were so slurred that half of them didn't make sense. My family shifted in their seats. Rachel's family looked at the floor. She went on for 5 minutes about how much she sacrificed for Haley. How hard it was being a single mother every weekend. How nobody understood her struggles. I sat in the front row with my hands folded and let everyone see exactly who she was. Let them see the woman who chose gambling over saving our daughter's life. After the funeral, I spent 3 days calling every lawyer in the area until I found Gareth Lawson, who specialized in wrongful death cases. His office was in a strip mall next to a dry cleaner, and when I walked in carrying my evidence binder, his wife Antonia was at the reception desk. She took one look at my face and brought me straight back to his office without making me wait. Gareth was a big guy with gray hair who listened to my whole story without interrupting once. I spread out all my evidence on his desk. The call logs showing 52 ignored calls, the texts from the sleepover mom with timestamps, photos of Haley unconscious on the bathroom floor. Antonia sat next to him taking notes on a yellow legal pad while he went through each document. When he got to the part about Rachel saying she needed to win back her $3,000, his face turned red. He explained that wrongful death lawsuits work differently than criminal cases. We only need to prove Rachel's negligence directly caused Haley's death, not that she intended to kill her. The burden of proof was lower, but we still needed solid evidence linking her choices to the outcome. He said we had a strong foundation, but needed more documentation to make it airtight. That night, I stayed up until 4 in the morning on my laptop researching the casino's policies online. Their website had pages about responsible gaming and self-exclusion programs, but nothing about emergency situations. I found their corporate handbook through a former employee's LinkedIn post, and it had detailed protocols for removing drunk patrons, catching card counters, and handling medical emergencies on the gaming floor. But there was absolutely nothing about notifying gamblers of family emergencies or any duty to intervene when someone refuses to leave for a dying child. This gap in their procedures meant they had no official policy requiring them to help, but it also meant they had no policy preventing them from helping either. I printed everything and highlighted the relevant sections. The next morning, I drove to the hospital records department and filled out formal requests for all of Haley's medical files. The clerk said it would take 2 weeks for processing, but when I explained what happened, she went to the back and came out 20 minutes later with everything. The EMS report was hard to read. It documented Haley's blood sugar at over 600 when they arrived, her breathing shallow, her skin cold and clammy. The hospital intake forms showed she was in severe diabetic ketoacidosis, with her organs already starting to shut down. But the worst part was the doctor's note stating that with prompt insulin administration, meaning within 30 minutes of the pump failure, Haley would have had a 95% chance of full recovery. Instead, she went over 2 hours without it. The medical examiner's report confirmed the cause of death as complications from diabetic ketoacidosis due to lack of insulin. I photocopied everything 3 times. Over the next week, I wrote out every single detail from that night for Gareth, starting from when the sleepover mom first called me. 20 pages of pure facts, no emotions, just what happened when. I included exact quotes from my calls with Rachel, what the casino employee said when I begged them to get her, what the paramedic told me about not being able to give insulin. Writing it all down made me see the clear line from Rachel choosing to stay at the casino to Haley dying in that hospital bed. Each decision point where she could have left, but didn't. Each minute that passed while our daughter's body poisoned itself. Gareth read through my statement 3 times, making notes in the margins. He had me sign and date every page. Gareth drafted preservation letters that afternoon and sent them by certified mail to the casino's legal department and to Rachel's apartment. The letters demanded they preserve all surveillance footage from that night, all transaction records showing Rachel's gambling activity, her player rewards card data, and any phone records from calls made to or from the casino. He explained that destroying any of this evidence after receiving the letter would be spoliation, which could result in serious legal consequences. The casino's lawyers responded within 48 hours, saying they would comply, but only with a court order. Rachel never responded at all. We filed the wrongful death lawsuit the following Monday, and Gareth had a process server deliver the papers to Rachel at her apartment. The server knocked for 10 minutes before she finally answered, and he said she threw the papers back at him and slammed the door. He picked them up off the hallway floor and left them at her door, which still counted as proper service. Gareth warned me this was just the beginning of what would be a long, expensive fight, but at least we were doing something instead of just sitting around grieving. 2 days later, Regina Norris from CPS called to schedule a follow-up meeting with me. She'd already done a home visit with Rachel, and while she couldn't share specifics due to confidentiality rules, she said there were concerning findings about Rachel's living situation and priorities that would be documented in her report. Her voice sounded disgusted when she mentioned finding gambling receipts and empty wine bottles, but no food in the refrigerator. The next week, I got served with papers at work, right in front of my coworkers. Rachel had filed for a restraining order claiming I was harassing her with threatening phone calls and showing up at her apartment. It was complete lies since I hadn't contacted her once since the funeral, but I still had to hire Gareth to defend against it, which meant another retainer fee I could barely afford. I sold my motorcycle that weekend to cover the legal costs. I searched online for the casino's corporate structure and found their compliance officer was someone named Nora Kemp. I called her office directly and left a message explaining who I was and asking to discuss their emergency notification policies. She called back the next day, defensive from the start, saying the casino had no legal obligation to intervene in personal matters. But when I pushed about whether they'd reviewed their policies after a child died because one of their customers wouldn't leave, she admitted we are conducting an internal review. She agreed to a formal meeting the following week. Meanwhile, I contacted the insulin pump manufacturer and requested all the data from Haley's device for the 48 hours before her death. Their technical team sent me a detailed report showing the pump had sent 17 urgent alarms starting at 11:45 that night, each one requiring manual acknowledgement and intervention with backup insulin. The alarms got progressively more urgent, with the final ones warning of life-threatening blood sugar levels. This proved Rachel had clear, repeated warnings that Haley needed immediate help, but chose to ignore them all. Gareth called me the next morning saying he was drafting subpoenas for the casino to get their surveillance footage from that night, plus all of Rachel's player rewards data showing how long she'd been there and what she'd been playing. The casino's lawyers immediately filed motions to block the subpoenas, claiming customer privacy and that they had no duty to preserve evidence. But Gareth had expected this. and already had counter-arguments ready about the footage being material evidence in a wrongful death case. 3 weeks of back-and-forth legal filings later, the judge finally ordered them to comply and turn over everything within 10 days. Meanwhile, I drove to the sleepover mom's house with Gareth's paralegal wife, Antonia, who brought all the paperwork for a sworn affidavit. The mom was still shaken up about that night, her hands trembling as she signed page after page describing exactly what she'd witnessed, including Rachel's exact words on the phone. When she'd called to beg her to bring the insulin, how Haley had gone from talking to unconscious in less than an hour, and how she'd had to hold my daughter's hair back while she threw up before losing consciousness completely. Antonia recorded everything on her phone too, getting every detail about the timeline and Haley's condition documented officially. That same week, I discovered Rachel had started posting on Facebook about Haley's death, twisting everything to make herself the victim. She wrote long posts about how I should have lived closer to be a responsible father, how I should have made sure the sleepover family had backup supplies, how the insulin pump company was really to blame for the malfunction. Some of our mutual friends were actually buying her lies and commenting with sympathy for her, while others who knew the truth stayed silent because they didn't want to get involved in the drama. I screenshot every single post before she could delete them, adding them to my evidence folder. District Attorney Damon Hunt called me in for a meeting about potential criminal charges, and I brought all my documentation hoping he'd arrest Rachel immediately. He spent 2 hours reviewing everything, but then explained that criminal negligence resulting in death had an extremely high burden of proof, that they'd have to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Rachel knew her actions would likely result in death and chose to do them anyway. He said they were opening an investigation, but it could take months before they decided whether to file charges, and even then, conviction rates for these cases were low. I left his office feeling defeated, but he promised they were taking it seriously and would be thorough. My first therapy appointment with Henrietta Carlson was 2 days later, and I spent most of the hour describing in detail all the ways I fantasized about making Rachel suffer for what she'd done. I told her about driving past her apartment at night, about researching things online I shouldn't have been researching, about the pure rage that consumed me every waking moment. She didn't judge me, but helped me see that going down that path would only destroy my life further and wouldn't bring Haley back. We made a concrete plan with clear boundaries where I promised myself I would only seek justice through legal channels, no matter how much I wanted to take matters into my own hands. The legal bills were piling up faster than I expected, with Gareth's retainer already used up and new bills coming for every filing, every hour of research, every meeting. I sold my motorcycle first, then my good tools from the garage, then some furniture I didn't really need, and finally my father's watch that I'd planned to give Haley when she turned 18. Each sale felt like another sacrifice for my daughter, another piece of my life traded away to fund this fight. But I needed every dollar to keep the legal pressure on Rachel. In my next session, Henrietta helped me write out a victim impact statement that clearly stated my goals without the raw anger that had been consuming me. We worked on articulating what I actually wanted, which was getting the truth on official record, holding Rachel legally accountable for her choices, and creating changes that might prevent another child from dying the same way. Having these specific objectives written down helped transform my rage into something more focused and purposeful. Nora from the casino called to schedule a virtual meeting about their policies, and Gareth spent hours preparing me with questions about their duty of care when customers are notified about emergencies involving children. We researched similar cases, found precedents about businesses having moral if not legal obligations to assist in emergencies, and prepared documentation showing how their refusal to intervene contributed to Haley's death. During the actual meeting, the casino's management team was cold and corporate, insisting they couldn't force patrons to leave for personal matters and had no obligation to intervene in family emergencies. They kept repeating that their security couldn't physically remove a customer who wasn't breaking casino rules, that doing so would open them to lawsuits, that they had no way to verify if phone calls about emergencies were real or not. Their complete lack of humanity made me even more determined to find ways to hold them accountable. After that meeting, I spent 3 days writing a detailed complaint to the Gaming Commission about the casino's failure to have any emergency intervention protocols, including transcripts from my calls that night begging them to help save my daughter's life. The investigator assigned to my case, Julio De Leon, actually seemed to care when we talked on the phone, asking detailed questions and saying this was exactly the kind of thing the Gaming Commission should address to protect public welfare. He opened a formal investigation into their practices and said they'd be reviewing whether casinos should be required to have protocols for patron notification during medical emergencies involving minors. 2 weeks after that call with Julio, I came home from work to find a thick envelope from CPS waiting in my mailbox. My hands shook as I opened it right there on my front porch, scanning past all the formal language until I found what mattered. Regina Norris had completed her investigation and officially substantiated medical neglect against Rachel. The letter laid out in cold, bureaucratic terms how Rachel's refusal to leave the casino while possessing life-saving medication constituted child neglect under state law. I read it 3 times before going inside, then immediately scanned it and sent copies to Gareth and Antonia. This wasn't criminal charges. Regina had been clear about that from the start, but having an official government agency confirm that Rachel's actions killed our daughter felt like the first real victory in months. I put the original in my filing cabinet with all the other evidence, another piece of ammunition for the civil case. The next morning, Gareth called me into his office where he had a stack of papers spread across his conference table. The phone records from Rachel's carrier had finally come through after weeks of legal back and forth, and they painted a damning picture. The location data showed Rachel arriving at the casino at 8:47 p.m. and not leaving until 1:08 a.m., well after Haley was already dying in the ICU. The call logs showed every one of my 52 calls going unanswered, each one lasting only seconds before being declined. Gareth pointed to specific timestamps showing Rachel actively rejecting calls while making bets, the casino's transaction records lining up perfectly with the declined calls. We spent 3 hours creating a timeline chart that showed exactly where Rachel was and what she was doing while our daughter's organs were shutting down. Antonia took photos of everything and started organizing it into the master file, while Gareth explained how we'd use this in depositions. I thought things were moving in the right direction until the process server showed up at my door 4 days later. Rachel was countersuing me for emotional distress, defamation, and harassment, seeking damages of $200,000. Her attorney, Edward Doyle, had crafted a narrative painting me as a vindictive ex-husband using our daughter's death to destroy Rachel's life out of spite. The lawsuit claimed I'd orchestrated a campaign of harassment through CPS, the Gaming Commission, and social media to ruin her reputation and mental health. I drove straight to Gareth's office with the papers, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. He read through them quickly, shaking his head at some of the more ridiculous claims, then assured me this was a common defensive tactic. We'd have to respond formally, which meant more legal fees I could barely afford, but he said judges usually saw through these revenge lawsuits. The hearing about Rachel's countersuit came 2 weeks later in a small courtroom downtown. Edward Doyle stood up and spent 20 minutes describing how I'd turned our daughter's tragic death from a medical equipment failure into a weapon against his client. He claimed I'd made Rachel's life unbearable with constant legal attacks and public shaming. The judge listened without expression, then asked Gareth for our response. Gareth calmly presented the CPS finding, the phone records, and the timeline of events, explaining that every legal action I'd taken was a legitimate response to documented neglect. After an hour of arguments, the judge made her ruling. She dismissed most of Rachel's counterclaims, but ordered that all communication between us had to go through our attorneys from now on. No direct contact by phone, email, text, or in person, with violations punishable by contempt of court. Part of me was frustrated since Rachel could use this to avoid accountability, but another part was relieved since it removed the temptation to confront her directly. That Thursday, I sat in Henrietta's office for our weekly session, finally admitting something I'd been hiding for weeks. I'd been having dreams about hurting Rachel in detailed, specific ways that scared me when I woke up. Sometimes I'd imagine showing up at the casino and dragging her out by her hair. Other times I'd dream about burning down her apartment or running her off the road. Henrietta didn't judge, just helped me understand these were normal grief responses that needed healthy outlets. We spent the session working on channeling the violent energy into productive legal strategies and advocacy work. She had me write down each violent fantasy, then rewrite it as a legal action I could actually take. The fantasy of physical confrontation became preparing for depositions. The urge to destroy her property became placing liens on assets. The desire to hurt her became working toward a guilty verdict. By the end of the session, I had a list of concrete legal steps that would satisfy my need for justice without landing me in prison. Over the next 3 days, I turned my dining room into a war room, spreading out every document, photo, and piece of evidence across the table and walls. I bought a label maker and color-coded folders, organizing everything chronologically from the first custody hearing to the present. Each section had tabs for medical records, phone logs, witness statements, and legal filings. I created a master index that cross-referenced everything, making it easy to find any piece of evidence within seconds. When Antonia came by to pick up copies for their office, she stood in my dining room just staring at the walls covered in timelines and evidence charts. She said in 15 years as a paralegal, she'd never seen a client prepare a case this thoroughly. It took her 2 hours just to photograph everything for their records. The following Monday, Julio called with news that the Gaming Commission had scheduled an official hearing to review the casino's emergency intervention policies. He said my complaint had triggered a larger investigation into whether casinos had any duty to assist when informed about medical emergencies involving children. The hearing would be in 3 weeks, and they wanted me to testify about what happened that night. I spent the rest of the day researching similar cases and found 3 instances in other states where casinos had been held liable for not responding to emergencies. While going through Rachel's social media looking for evidence, I noticed something interesting in the background of one of her photos. There was an eviction notice taped to her door that she'd apparently not seen when taking a selfie. I did some digging through public records and discovered she was 3 months behind on rent and facing court-ordered eviction. When I told Gareth, he got excited, explaining we could place liens on any assets or income for our civil judgment, including her security deposit and any future earnings. The moral weight of potentially making my daughter's mother homeless sat heavy on me. But then I remembered Haley dying alone while Rachel chose blackjack over her baby. 2 nights later, I made a mistake that could have ruined everything. I'd been drinking alone, looking at Haley's photos and suddenly found myself in my car with the engine running, Rachel's address pulled up on my phone. The rage felt like it was eating me alive, and all I wanted was to make her hurt the way I hurt every single day. I made it 3 blocks before something in me snapped back to reality. I pulled over and called Henrietta, who talked to me for an hour until I was calm enough to drive home. The next morning, I woke up sick with shame and fear about how close I'd come to throwing everything away. I poured every bottle down the sink and promised Haley's picture that I'd stay sober and strategic, that I'd get justice the right way. After weeks of Edward Doyle filing motion after motion trying to delay proceedings, the judge finally had enough and set a firm deposition date for Rachel. Gareth spent 6 hours preparing me for what was coming, explaining how Edward would try to twist my words and make me lose my temper. We practiced with Gareth playing Edward, asking the most horrible questions about my parenting and trying to blame me for Haley's death. He taught me to pause before answering, to keep responses short and factual, and to never argue with opposing counsel. The deposition was set for next month, and Gareth warned me it would be one of the hardest days of my life, sitting across from Rachel while her lawyer tried to break me. 3 weeks later, I'm sitting in a conference room watching Rachel lie through her teeth while a court reporter types every word. Edward had coached her well, but not well enough because she kept forgetting which version of events she was supposed to stick to. First, she said she didn't know Haley was sick. Then she said she thought it was just high blood sugar that would come down on its own. Then she claimed the sleepover mom never told her it was an emergency. Gareth let her talk for 2 hours, occasionally asking simple questions that made her contradict herself again and again. The court reporter's fingers never stopped moving as Rachel dug herself deeper with each answer. At one point, Gareth asked her about the phone calls, and she actually said the words that made my stomach turn. "Look, even if I knew she was having issues, I'm not a doctor. How was I supposed to know it was that serious?" Gareth paused and repeated her words back slowly while the court reporter captured it all. Edward tried to call for a break, but Rachel kept talking, saying she had important plans that night and couldn't just drop everything for what might have been nothing. The deposition went on for 6 hours, and by the end, Rachel had given us enough contradictions to fill 20 pages. 2 days later, Julio called with news that made me actually smile for the first time in months. The casino had issued a press release announcing they were reviewing their emergency intervention policies for situations involving children. They made sure to state 3 times that this wasn't an admission of any liability in our case, but Julio explained this was actually huge because it showed they were worried about the Gaming Commission investigation. The policy changes wouldn't help Haley, but maybe some other kid would get saved because a casino employee would actually do something when a parent said their child was dying. I was in the middle of grocery shopping when my phone rang with a number I recognized as the district attorney's office. Damon Hunt introduced himself and said they were reopening the criminal investigation based on new evidence from the CPS report and the deposition transcripts. He explained they were now looking at potential negligent homicide charges instead of just child endangerment, though he was careful to warn me that prosecution was still uncertain because proving criminal intent in neglect cases was incredibly hard. I abandoned my cart in the cereal aisle and sat in my car for 20 minutes processing what this meant. Real criminal charges, not just civil lawsuits, actual consequences that might include jail time. The next morning, Gareth called me at 6 a.m., which never meant good news. The sleepover mom had contacted him crying because Rachel had shown up at her house the night before demanding she change her testimony. Rachel had apparently threatened to sue her for not taking Haley to the hospital herself and said she'd make her life hell if she testified in court. The sleepover mom had been smart enough to record the whole thing on her doorbell camera and already filed a police report. Within hours, Rachel had witness tampering charges added to her growing list of legal problems. Edward must have been having the worst week of his career trying to manage the mess Rachel kept creating for herself. 3 days later, I was sitting in a government building downtown waiting to testify at the Gaming Commission hearing. When they called me in, I faced 5 commission members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. I started talking about that night, about calling the casino and begging them to get Rachel to leave with the insulin. I showed them the photos of Haley from her last birthday, then the ones from the ICU, and I watched their faces change as I explained how a simple policy requiring staff to notify parents of emergencies could have saved her life. One commissioner actually had tears in her eyes when I finished, and the chairman said they would take my testimony under serious consideration for new regulations. After the hearing, Gareth asked to meet at his office, and I could tell from his voice something was wrong. He and Antonia sat me down with a folder full of financial records they'd gotten through discovery. Rachel had less than $2,000 in the bank, no retirement accounts, no property, and no insurance policies. Any civil judgment we won would be basically meaningless because there was nothing to collect. Gareth explained we could garnish future wages, but with Rachel's spotty employment history, that might mean waiting years for pennies. I told him I didn't care about the money. I just wanted the truth on record, and Antonia squeezed my hand and said that was the right reason to keep going. My next therapy session with Henrietta turned into something different from usual. Instead of talking about my anger, she asked me what winning would actually look like. Not revenge fantasies, but real, achievable goals. We spent the hour redefining success as getting Rachel's neglect officially documented in court records and helping create policy changes that would protect other kids. She helped me see that these things mattered more than Rachel's suffering, that Haley's legacy could be saving other children rather than just punishing her mother. I left feeling lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying rocks I didn't need. 2 weeks went by before Damon Hunt called again with news that made me want to throw my phone. He was offering Rachel a plea deal for misdemeanor child endangerment, just 2 years probation with mandatory addiction treatment and 200 hours of community service. No jail time, no felony record, just a slap on the wrist for letting our daughter die. Gareth had to talk me down, explaining that if Rachel took the deal, she'd be admitting guilt, which we could use as evidence in the civil trial. It was chess, not checkers, and we needed to think 3 moves ahead. Gareth and Antonia spent a whole afternoon at their conference table with law books and laptops everywhere, working out exactly how to use Rachel's criminal plea as ammunition in our civil case. They explained that once she admitted to child endangerment in criminal court, she couldn't deny liability in civil court. It was called collateral estoppel or something like that, basically meaning she'd be forced to admit wrongdoing. We could use her guilty plea to essentially guarantee a verdict in our favor, turning her attempt to avoid serious criminal charges into a confession we could use to get justice for Haley. The strategy felt smart but also exhausting because everything took so much planning and patience when all I wanted was for someone to just acknowledge that Rachel killed our daughter. 2 months after filing the lawsuit, we finally sat down for settlement negotiations with Rachel and Edward in a mediator's office downtown. The mediator tried for 4 hours to get Rachel to accept any responsibility at all, but she kept insisting she was the real victim here. She actually said those words while sitting across from the father of the child she let die. Edward kept trying to redirect the conversation to settlement amounts, but Rachel would interrupt to explain how none of this was her fault. The mediator finally called it hopeless and ended the session. We were going to trial, which meant I'd have to sit on a witness stand and relive the worst night of my life in front of strangers, but at least the truth would finally be told in court where it mattered. 3 weeks later, I drove to the cemetery alone for the first time since the funeral. The grass over Haley's plot was still patchy and new, and I knelt down beside the small headstone we'd picked out together before everything went bad. I traced her name with my finger and told her I'd get justice, but I wouldn't destroy myself doing it. The anger that had been burning in my chest for months felt different there, less like fire and more like cold determination. I stayed until the sun started setting, then drove home and called Henrietta to schedule extra sessions because I needed help staying focused on legal channels instead of the dark thoughts that kept creeping in. 2 months passed before the civil trial finally started, and that first morning I sat behind Gareth watching the jury file in, 12 strangers who would decide if Rachel was responsible for killing our daughter. The paramedic who'd responded to the sleepover house took the stand first, describing Haley's condition when they arrived, how her blood sugar was too high for their equipment to read, how they'd begged Rachel to bring the insulin. His voice cracked when he described watching Haley slip deeper into unconsciousness while we waited for her mother to leave the casino. The ICU doctor testified next, explaining in simple terms how diabetic ketoacidosis works, how Haley's organs shut down one by one during those 2 hours without insulin. She showed the jury charts and timelines proving that if Rachel had brought the insulin within 30 minutes, Haley would have survived with minimal complications. Edward tried to object to everything, but the judge let most of it through, and I watched the jury taking notes, their faces getting more serious with each piece of evidence. On day 2, Edward brought in his own expert who tried to blame the insulin pump manufacturer, saying the device failed without proper warning. But Gareth had prepared for this, and our medical expert walked the jury through the pump's data logs, showing it had sent 17 alerts over 40 minutes before failing completely. The expert explained how the alerts specifically instructed users to switch to backup insulin immediately, and I saw several jurors nodding when he said any responsible caregiver would have had backup supplies ready. Rachel took the stand on day 3, and watching her try to cry without tears, while claiming she thought the sleepover mom was exaggerating, made my hands shake with rage. She actually said she'd planned to leave the casino after finishing her hand, but then I'd called and distracted her, causing her to lose money, which made her stay longer to win it back. One juror actually gasped when Rachel said that, and another shook her head in disgust. The jury went to deliberate after closing arguments, and those 4 hours of waiting felt longer than the entire trial. When they came back, the foreman stood up and read that they found Rachel liable for wrongful death, awarding $75,000 in damages. It wasn't about the money since Gareth had already explained Rachel had no assets to collect, but hearing 12 people officially say Rachel killed Haley through negligence meant everything. Rachel's face went white when she heard the verdict, and she started screaming that it wasn't fair, that I'd turned everyone against her. The judge had to threaten her with contempt before she finally shut up and stormed out with Edward trailing behind. A week later, Damon called to say Rachel had accepted the plea deal for misdemeanor child endangerment, 2 years probation, mandatory addiction counseling 3 times a week, and 200 hours of community service at a children's hospital. I wanted to scream that it wasn't enough, that she should be in prison. But Gareth reminded me that her guilty plea was now part of the permanent record. 3 months into her probation, the Gaming Commission finally held their hearing about the casino's policies. I testified again, explaining how they'd refused to intervene even when told a child was dying, and Julio presented evidence showing this wasn't the first time they'd ignored emergency situations for high-rolling customers. The commission issued a formal censure and mandated that all casinos in the state implement new emergency intervention protocols within 90 days. Knowing that other kids might be saved because of what happened to Haley gave me the first real sense of purpose I'd felt since her death. Rachel filed for bankruptcy 2 weeks after the commission ruling, which Gareth said was expected since she owed money everywhere and had no income. The bankruptcy court discharged most of her debts but couldn't touch the wrongful death judgment, not that it mattered since she had nothing to collect anyway. Then 4 months into her probation, I got a call from Damon saying Rachel had been arrested at a casino 40 miles away. She'd driven there thinking she was outside her probation officer's jurisdiction, but casino security recognized her from alerts sent to all regional casinos. The judge gave her 30 days in county jail for the violation and extended her probation by a year. I went to the courthouse to watch them take her away in handcuffs, expecting to feel satisfaction. But mostly I just felt tired. The burning need for revenge that had kept me going for almost a year was fading into something else. Not forgiveness, but maybe acceptance that Rachel's life was already destroyed. She'd lost her daughter, her freedom, any chance at a normal life, and while none of it brought Haley back, the truth was officially documented in court records forever. I started seeing Henrietta twice a week to work on building routines that didn't revolve around destroying Rachel. We made specific plans for handling difficult days like Haley's birthday and the anniversary of her death, and she helped me return to work part-time at first, then gradually increase my hours. I started going to the gym in the mornings before work because the physical exhaustion helped quiet the constant replay of that night in my head. The grief didn't get smaller, but I learned to build my life around it, creating space for both the pain and the possibility of moving forward without Haley, but with her memory guiding me towards something better than revenge. The sleepover mom called me 3 weeks later asking if I wanted to grab coffee, and I met her at a small place near the courthouse where we sat for 2 hours talking about that night and about Haley's love for her daughter's friendship. She started texting me every Thursday to meet up, and we'd sit at the same corner table sharing stories about Haley without lawyers or depositions or court reporters taking notes. She told me things I never knew, like how Haley would braid her daughter's hair during sleepovers and teach her card games I'd taught Haley when she was 5. One morning she brought a box of photos from various sleepovers, and I saw my daughter laughing and playing dress-up and being a normal kid in ways I hadn't seen since the divorce started. We became real friends over those coffee meetings. 2 people connected by tragedy who understood each other without having to explain the weight we carried. A month later, I stood in front of 15 parents at the diabetes support group meeting in the basement of the community center, my hands shaking as I explained what happened to Haley and how multiple backup plans could have saved her. I showed them the timeline I'd created, pointing out every moment where a different preparation could have changed everything, and several parents took photos of my checklist for emergency supplies. After the meeting, a woman named Kyla approached me with tears in her eyes, explaining she'd lost her son to a different medical crisis, but understood the specific pain of preventable death. We exchanged numbers and started meeting for lunch every couple weeks, and she became someone who got it when I said I was having a bad day without needing details. She taught me breathing exercises for when the anger came back, and I helped her organize her son's memorial fundraiser, 2 broken parents helping each other function. I packaged up all of Haley's medical records and the case documents and sent them to the insulin pump manufacturer with a detailed letter about what went wrong. 3 weeks later, their medical director called me personally to discuss the case, and we spent 90 minutes going through every detail of that night. They flew me out to their headquarters where I presented Haley's story to their entire safety team, showing them the photos from that night and explaining how their emergency protocols failed. 6 months later, they sent me their updated caregiver education materials with new sections on backup preparedness and emergency response plans, and seeing "developed in memory of Haley" in small print at the bottom made me cry for the first time in weeks. The diabetes support group decided to create a scholarship fund after hearing Haley's story, and we started with a goal of raising enough to help 5 families afford backup supplies. I set up the donation page and shared it on social media, and within 3 days, we'd raised $2,000 from people who'd never even met Haley, but understood the fear of not affording medical supplies. By the end of the first month, we'd raised over $5,000, enough to provide emergency kits to 23 families who came to the community center for help. Every kit we gave out had a small card with Haley's picture that said, "Stay prepared, stay safe," and watching parents read it and hug their kids tighter gave me purpose I hadn't felt since she died. The official letter from Damon arrived on a Tuesday morning, stating all criminal proceedings were complete and the case was officially closed. I sat on my couch reading it 3 times, then went to my bedroom and slept for 14 hours straight, the exhaustion I'd been fighting for almost a year finally catching up. When I woke up the next afternoon, I felt different. Not better exactly, but less wound up, like a spring that had finally been allowed to relax. That night I slept 8 hours without waking up once. No nightmares about that bathroom floor, no replaying phone calls, just deep, empty sleep that my body desperately needed. 3 days later, I was picking up groceries when I turned into the cereal aisle and saw Rachel standing there holding a box of Haley's favorite brand. She looked smaller somehow, her designer clothes replaced with sweatpants and an old t-shirt, her face hollow and tired. She saw me and started walking toward me with her mouth opening to speak, but I just turned my cart around and walked to the next aisle without saying anything. My hands weren't shaking and my heart wasn't racing. I just didn't have anything to say to her anymore, and that self-control felt like the biggest victory I'd had in this whole process. I passed her again at the checkout and she was crying, but I just paid for my groceries and left. No anger, no satisfaction, just done. I started writing everything down 2 weeks after that grocery store encounter, typing out the whole story from the beginning on my laptop late at night when I couldn't sleep. Getting it all out helped me see the path from that first phone call to where I was now, from pure rage to something more useful. The pain was still there, sharp as ever when I thought about Haley's last hours, but writing helped me understand how I'd changed from wanting to destroy Rachel to wanting to protect other kids. Each page I wrote felt like organizing the chaos in my head into something that made sense, and maybe something that could help other parents going through similar hell. This morning I loaded my car with 30 emergency supply packages I'd assembled using some of the scholarship money, each one containing glucose tablets, glucagon kits, and laminated instruction cards for diabetes emergencies. I drove to 5 different community centers around the city, delivering 6 packages to each one with instructions to keep them accessible for any child who needed them. Every package had a bright orange label that said, "In memory of Haley, be prepared," with the emergency hotline number and basic instructions for recognizing diabetic crisis. The last delivery was to the community center where Haley used to take art classes, and the director remembered her and cried when I explained what I was doing. This quiet work of preventing other tragedies felt more meaningful than any revenge I'd imagined in those early dark days, and I knew Haley would be proud of her dad for choosing to help instead of hurt. Well, that's gonna do it for me today. Appreciate you hanging out and questioning things right along with me. Always feels like a real journey when we share it together. Subscribe for more content like this.